Russia was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And they'd say, oh, but aren't you so glad that you're in America? I said, well, I know a lot of Russian filmmakers. They have a lot more freedom than I have. All they have to do is be careful about criticizing the government.
Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Myles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. Before we start, if you're new to the channel, please hit that like button, hit subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you're alerted whenever we go live, as we're constantly adding new shows. Just so you know, I did play the wrong intro music. I'm so used to it being just me. When it's just me, it's like usually a pop life. So my bad. This is a regular This is Revolution show, but it's just me. And this is pre-recorded. So sadly, we won't be able to see your guys' wonderful comments, conspiracy theories, what we got wrong about said movie. Sorry. Definitely, you can tell me in the Champagne Room. We will be going live. The Champagne Room will be live. Toussaint and I definitely want to talk to you guys about some stuff I read in the paper. As always, thank you to all the YouTube and Twitch subscribers and everyone that subscribes on any platforms. Don't forget, if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and according to the statistics, about 49% of the audio-only podcast listeners listen to us on Apple. You can subscribe to the show and get access to the Champagne Room. If you'd like to have access to the Champagne Room, if you have the means and feel so inclined and would like to support the show so we can continue to stay on the air and bring you this quality programming, become a patron for as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year. It could all be yours. Access to Champagne Rooms past and present. Be part of the live virtual audience for the Pascal, Robert, Hurst, and Mau Hour. And also join us for movie night. And right now, all the patrons are getting the PDF of my latest I Was a Teenage Anarchist. And patrons get a special discount code if they want tickets to the live meet and greet that'll be going on this Saturday, November 18th in Fairfield, California. Ben Burgess is going to be there to kick the whole thing off. Chris Contos from Machine Head Forbidden, The Boneless Ones, Attitude Adjustment, so many bands. Craig LaCicero from Forbidden, and Rick Hunolt from Exodus and Die Humane. So many originators of that Bay Area thrash sound. We're going to be talking about the cultures of authenticity and deconstruction. Definitely going to be mingling with the folks. It's a nice, quaint environment. There's going to be food. There's going to be beverages, adult beverages. I want to see your face in the place wherever you are watching this show. There are links in the description. Again, if you're a patron, there's a special discount code for you. So all that being said, let me bring in my guest. We tried to record this earlier in the week, and literally the system that we used shut down. Everything shut down. So let's knock on wood. I've had a system shut down. Yesterday, if you watched the show, literally the power went out in my whole area in the middle of the stream. So let's hope for the best. During the early days of the Race to the Moon, American cinema was filled with visions of a bright future of flying cars and a less reliance on fossil fuels, electric everything, and robot servants. After the moon landing, why has the depiction of the future been one of corporatocracy? I practice saying that word all day, and then I did an interview before this show, and I totally forgot. From Blade Runner to Terminator, the rise of machines and machine learning is no longer the future of leisure and entertainment, but one of nightmares. Our guest, Micheal Harris, has a new book out that tells us how science fiction isn't simply predicting the future, but using the idea of the future to warn us about our now. Please welcome Micheal Harris.
Hi, Jason. I think the titles were excellent. The titles were perfect for this.
We were doing a show and we're about a half hour in, and then bam, everything just crashed on us. So I'm just gonna go from jump. Micheal, why do you think the early Cold War / space race visions of the future weren't so laden with man's corporate control of the planet and its resources, but more with the hope of a technologically advanced civilization? At worst, we say nuclear-powered monsters, or we see nuclear-powered monsters that were an accident or evil aliens, but that was about it. What leads us to Soylent Green and silent runnings of the early 70s?
So the best science fiction needs to be credible, right?
Mhm.
And we enjoy fantasy stories, but if you're really going to speak to an audience, it has to feel like it could be a future, however dramatized. And I think that 1950s flying cars, space rockets future just no longer became credible, is the first reason. Audiences wouldn't respond to it. It seemed rather dated. And then in terms of the filmmakers and the writers, you had going on, of course, in the late 1960s, 1970s, the rise of the environmental movement, the New Left. That environmental movement starts off being about kind of national parks and air pollution, however important, those things are. But parts of that environmental movement become more critical of the machine, in New Left parlance, of capitalism. And it's that turn into predictions of environmental catastrophe unless we change course, which then is also reflected in, I think, some of the best sci-fi, because that's what's happening in our politics in many countries. And so it feels like it speaks to a future more than the kind of 1950s Jetsons stuff could ever have done. And there was that period in terms of the film business as well, where the studio system had broken down at the end of the 1960s, and you get the new filmmakers seizing that opportunity, including, people like George Lucas, Francis Ford Coppola, and so on. That also happens in science fiction. They seize the opportunities to make maybe more politically interesting, socially conscious films than they had the chance to do in the old 1950s, 1960s studio system.
I mean, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think the New Left definitely has an imprint on science fiction. A lot of movies in the early 70s. Definitely, if people haven't checked it out, go watch Silent Runnings. It's one of those science fiction movies that I think gets forgotten because Alien becomes such a large Alien in 2001 are just so large in the science fiction viewing community that sometimes movies like that get forgotten. You also write about a classic film in your book, Back to the Future. And many people look at movies like Back to the Future Part 2 as a future that didn't happen. Cars and skateboards aren't flying. Some people, as you describe in the book, look at Back to the Future 2 as a very Reaganite film. But you write about how that couldn't be further from the truth. In the book, you say, the films not only critique the middle class entitlement, they suggest that greed, selfishness, and materialism are the problem. They're what screwed up the future, and absent the fantasy of time travel, it's too late to change what happens next. Even more, the middle class American promise of utopia may always have been a lie, and its decline has sown the seeds of its coming dystopia. So, what are the Back to the Future movies actually trying to tell us?
Yeah. So I should explain. So the new book I've got out, I used 9 science fiction movies from the 70s, but some of them are 80s and a couple in the 90s, to talk about how they've predicted the future that we're increasingly living in. And so there are some of the movies you might expect to be in there, like the Blade Runners and the Terminator 2s and so on. Soylent Green, Rollerball, you know, all great kind of in some ways socially conscious science fiction. Back to the Future, the Back to the Future series seems like it's the odd one out, because, as you say, many people will interpret that as a kind of Reaganite fantasy. You know, he has to go back to the idyllic 1950s to fix a problem with his family in the 80s. And at the end of the first movie, they all turn into, you know, successful yuppies. The father has published this successful science fiction book, you know, and they're living in their lovely pastel colored soft furnishing house and all of that. You think, okay, Reaganite fantasy. And of course, it's got Michael J. Fox, who was the star of Family Ties, where he plays the young Republican. So you put him in it, and, you know, and there's all this stuff about, they say at various points, you know, the future is what you make it. So it sounds like a very meritocratic, Reaganite, small town, idealistic movie. You can make your own future, you know, it's all up to you. Morning in America. But even in the first film, you look in the background of the small town, the local cinema is showing porn movies, you know, there's tattoo parlors, it's fraying at the edges. So, of course, this is 1985, the film comes out. So it's a year after Reagan's landslide election victory. This is supposed to be Morning in America. And it looks like the middle class, or the lower middle class, as represented by the McFly family at least, ain't doing too well. He then has to go back to the 1950s. And actually, the 1950s isn't this idyllic, conservative Reaganite 1950s that we're told we have to go back to. It's violent, it's sexist, racist. There's still, you know, exploitation in it. He tries to fix those problems. Seems like it's been fixed at the end. Pauline Kael, who was the famous film critic for the New Yorker, said, you know, the ending should be satire, but it isn't. But I absolutely think it is satire. You know, the way that family at the end is presented, it's the Michael J. Fox's character's projection of what success is in Reaganite America. It's supposed to be satirical, if you want to take it that way. And then, of course, we get on to Back to the Future 2, which is much more sci-fi dystopia. In particular, the alternative, is it 1985 or 2015?
2015, I believe, is supposed to be. Yeah.
The Trump-dominated, which really is making carnage. The filmmakers have explicitly said, we based that character, the Biff Tannen character, on Donald Trump. You know, so they're puncturing that Trumpian kind of self-made man, American success, wealth, and power thing, and saying, well, actually, this is what you get. You get this wasteland. So I think there's all that going on. Then in the third film, he has to go back 100 years to try and sort this stuff out. You know, and again, I think, you know, it can play to two audiences at the same time, right? Those that want a nice sci-fi fantasy comedy movie, but those who want to see something else in it. But I think what it's saying is the roots of this loss of the American dream go deep. You know, they are not about a lack of individual effort. They are about something, you know, the academics would call structural in these societies. And to go back to your first question, I think you can read it as being about disinvestment. Disinvestment in the public realm, and disinvestment in people. I mean, you look at the Michael J. Fox character, he's uninterested in school, right? He knows he doesn't want to turn out like his father, and he knows he gets a nice college education or whatever. He senses that's not going to make a difference. So this is not the character from Family Ties. Something else has happened to this character. You know, reality has hit this character in the face. And his only dream is being a rock star, which is like hoping you get out of your situation by being a sports star, right? That's the only way out. And then the only way the rich come to dominate in the future, really dominate, is through cheating. Biff
Yeah.
steals the sports almanac. You know, so I think there's a lot going on in there in terms of the decline of the American dream, why people are so angry. Because if we met up with the McFly family today, who do you think that they would be voting for? You know, there might be some Trumpists in there, right? Who's going to sort this shit out for us? We're angry. We've lost our opportunities.
It's interesting. You know, you sent me this manuscript, I think like 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So I've been fawning over this book for some time, and we had you on about a year ago to talk about it. Go back and check that show out. It was Dan Larson from Secret Galaxy was on that show as well. I rewatched Back to the Future 1 and 2, I think, when we did that show, and it was a whole different movie for me when you look at, especially Back to the Future 1, as Marty McFly saving the American dream or saving middle class security, because I didn't realize how rundown Hill Valley was.
Yeah.
Because the rundown suburb that I lived in Richmond, California, looked quite more frightening than Hill Valley. But when we go to Back to the Future Part 2 in kind of the Donald Trump world, it's all about sex and gambling, which I find fascinating because here we are in the moment of OnlyFans and legalized sports betting kind of in every state now. So even the way that sports is talked about in sports talk radio now is done from the perspective of gambling. If it's not fantasy, then it's literally like about point spreads, which really changes the way you see the game, because you're not looking at the game for what it is. You're looking at people that have individual value, and you're watching it for weird patterns, like this team does this after a rain out on a Thursday after a day-night doubleheader kind of thing. And you kind of bring that up in the book of the Biff Tannen world. And in the whole book, you're basically saying these guys aren't predicting the future. They're telling us about what they see going on right now. And I find that fascinating because, you know, those guys didn't think that Donald Trump was going to be president. That's why it was funny. And, you know, literally a year after it's supposed to take place, Donald Trump becomes president. What do you say to people that, because I'm sure in your casual conversation, when people find out what you do for a living, they want to comment about these movies predicting the future. What do you say to people that say that, oh, these movies are predicting the future, like The Simpsons and stuff like that? What do you say to that?
So, yeah, you're right that I think we can see some sci-fi as being more descriptive than it's attempting to be predictive. And as you were saying earlier, we often focus on the technology. So where's my flying car? Where's my self-lacing Nikes and all of that? Again, Back to the Future is really smart about that, because the 2015 they go to first, where you've got these, you know, holograms and all this stuff, is really, I think you can read that as a 1950s view of what 2015 might be like. Not a 1990s view, really. It's a kind of satire, and it's missing the point in that film and lots of other films where we go, well, we haven't got that technology. As you know, what's going on at the moment is the kind of tech bro right are saying, oh yeah, I'll tell you why we haven't got your flying car. It's because of the liberals. It's because of environmentalism and regulation and big government and so on. So, you know, recently Mark Andreessen, the boss of the big Silicon Valley venture capital firm, wrote this 10,000 word manifesto, you know, techno optimism. We can deliver all these things. And so, and we're fools, obviously, if we firstly just focus on the technology, and secondly, allow the technology to be determined and owned by all of those Silicon Valley, Elon Musk, tech bros. Because as we can talk about with some of the other films, it's not about the technology itself, it's about who owns it. That's really, I think, what our fear of some of these technologies is. It's that they're owned by certain people who are writing the codes for them, and we don't get to know what that code is. We don't get to know what that algorithm is. But we're asked to believe in that technologically optimistic future. And as you can see in these films, we've kind of been down that road in our imaginations. We're increasingly going down that road, or have gone down that road in real life. And these films were telling us that was going to be a problem. They were saying there are parts of the present when they were made that if we don't challenge them, if we don't form some resistance against them, are going to be the 2015 or the 2022 or the 2030, depicted in lots of these movies.
Now, you start the book off talking about Blade Runner. Your description of the universe in which Blade Runner is placed is one of people living in almost lawless conditions among the ruins of ecological collapse. Corporate rule has taken the place of more traditional liberal democracy. Rollerball has a similar feel as well, maybe not as dark in its presentation. You quote William Gibson, who says about his book Neuromancer, which kind of is the book that is one of the groundworks of cyberpunk, which is the universe that I would say that Blade Runner is in. It's definitely a cyberpunk universe. I wanted to write a novel where multinational capital took over, straighten that shit out, but the world was still problematic. Now you go on to write, in our world, we didn't need a nuclear exchange to lead to the withdrawal of the state from ensuring the security of citizens, let alone any role in advancing solutions to avert major crises in our world. Nuclear destruction didn't lead us to a Mad Max dystopia, Dr. Harris, but a failure of institutions has. Is that what sci-fi is ultimately telling us about the failure of institutions?
Well, I don't think it's so much the failure of institutions as the way this right-wing project, what we used to call the New Right before the new right, had this agenda from the 1960s and 1970s. And just before we talk about Blade Runner and Rollerball, what's also interesting about these films is some of these films get caught up in that project, in the sense that you look at something like Soylent Green, came out in 1973. That's bang in the middle of that rising, environmentally conscious, increasingly critical of capitalism period, before the Reagan pushback. And what I think has been not talked about enough is how that new right, the Reaganite, Thatcherite new right that was forming and planning in the 1960s, 1970s, took power in the 1980s in many countries, was in part a reaction to that rising capitalism critical environmental movement. So you have in Reagan's inauguration speech, he says there are no limits to growth. What's he talking about there? He's referencing one of the ideas that became more widespread in the 1970s, that there were limits to growth, that our rate of resource use would lead to a situation actually in the 2020s, 2030s, where we're approaching a kind of civilizational collapse. Not the Mad Max kind of wasteland, but the collapse in our institutions, the collapse in our environment, the collapse in our political systems, the collapse in trust and democracy and truth and so on. So Reagan is reacting to a report in part that was published a year before Soylent Green called The Limits to Growth, that is still the best-selling environmental book of all time, that put forward some of these scenarios about how we were heading for collapse, which is a kind of science fiction in itself, right? I'm going to tell you about various stories of the future. So the right, that right, is a reaction to the idea that there are limits. It's a reaction to the idea that government or popular public will can enforce some of those limits on how we exploit the environment. And it's saying through technology, we can escape those limits anyway. Don't worry. In the future, we're going to invent incredible technologies that will mean, we're using nuclear power instead. And energy is going to be free. That's what they said in the 1970s. Energy is going to be free. You only have to pay for it. So that's part of the story I'm telling in the book, is actually how the right was reacting to some of these ideas, including in sci-fi films. Sci-fi films become part of that political story in an interesting way. Then we get on to Blade Runner and Rollerball, and I think they're quite different in some respects. So Blade Runner is obviously, most people would say, it's obviously dystopian.
Yeah.
Everything is fucked up. The acid rain, the rich people and the healthy people have fucked off to off-world colonies. They've escaped, like in Elysium. And the rest of us are left here under corporate control. Rollerball is kind of interesting because I mean, I remember when I saw Rollerball as a kid, we used to rent movies we shouldn't have rented, like horror films. But anyway,
I know exactly the life you led. Yeah.
This is your experience as well. And we watched a lot of bad movies, but occasionally we'd watch movies that were like, wow, okay, we didn't realize this was like a very appraised movie. And Rollerball was one of them. I remember it being really dark and really chilling, and the violence in it, which is not especially graphic, but it's really crunchy.
Mm-hmm.
You feel this air of violence. Now, what I think is interesting about Rollerball, and I talk about this in the book, it is one of the questions we can ask is, well, we live in this neoliberal age. They've dominated politics and economics for 40 years. Where are the neoliberal utopias? Where are the depictions of those?
Mm-hmm.
And I think Rollerball is one of them. It's not meant to promote that neoliberal utopia, but this is a corporate dominated society. There are like 6 or whatever corporations who run everything, who own everything. And there is this violent sport. Now, often you get in the kind of futuristic violent sports movies, the idea is it's a pressure valve for the violence of ordinary people. They get to let off their violent impulses in this perfect society. But actually, if you watch Rollerball again, I think you can see it's the corporate society, the corporate run society, which is incredibly violent. But it's violent in obviously non-physical ways most of the time.
Like corporations are, right?
Like corporations are.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this incredible bit where John Houseman, who is the kind of corporate leader of the energy corporation, says to one of the Rollerball players, he says, do you know what corporate executives dream of? They dream of being Rollerball players and smashing people's faces in. And so I think you can read the film as it's that corporate violence which actually infects society, not that society needs this outlet of an increasingly violent future sport.
I mean, the corporate language that becomes so commonplace in the 80s, now we say mergers and acquisitions, but we used to say, corporate takeovers and things like that. I think you saw that for me, because they didn't have the courts that they could go to and they couldn't regulate through politicians. That's kind of what you see in the 90s for me with the drug trade. I mean, this is capitalism at large. They got a cheap product that they learned how to make a massive profit on by cooking it down into crack and cutting it so you get more of the inexpensive product. And the gangs that were already there are a built-in distribution system, and you already have kind of a captive base of people to buy your product because they can't really go anywhere. So, the violence of corporations is being acted out in the streets, and when we see it in that light, we have to act, right? As a nation, we need crime bills and we need to build more jails. But the corporatocracy is running rampant. Still, it's still for the most part unregulated and causes much more harm than the regional harm that you see with like street gangs. And never is it really regulated or even thought of to be regulated.
No, and rollerball is interesting because you wouldn't think at first sight, and obviously we should make clear to people we're talking about the original rollerball.
Yes, the 2003 rollerball doesn't count. Doesn't count.
Never happened.
Never happened. James Caan. So it's all James Caan.
It's all James Caan. And what's interesting, I don't know if you remember that scene. It's really haunting in the original rollerball. They go to a party. It's a corporate party.
Yes, I know the scene you're talking about.
And they're trying to get James Caan to retire because he's becoming too popular and he's becoming a bit of a figurehead. So you would think the film is not like super political at first sight because there's no revolutionary group, there's no resistance group that we see in the movie, plotting to take power or challenge that corporate power. But what we do see is the effect of that corporate society on people, even the privileged people in that society, never mind the wider public. So everyone is on drugs, everyone's on amphetamines, everyone's drunk. There's one bit where they just shoot lasers at trees for no reason, just kind of destroying shit. There's another scene where a corporate executive is kind of humiliated in front of everyone, and no one can remember the past. The corporate system has made everybody forget the past. In fact, there's a kind of internet, but you have to go to this one place in Switzerland to ask it questions.
Yeah,
because it's controlled by the corporations. It's a really kind of interesting look at that corporate conspiracy and domination, which of course was a classic 1970s movie theme beyond sci-fi, but including sci-fi.
I don't know if you know this, but that was an original idea for G.I. Joe after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the new bad guy was no longer going to be Cobra, but it was going to be Coil.
Okay.
Who was the twins, Tomat and Zamat, or no, whatever their names, I forget their names, but those were going to be the bad guys, the corporate bad guys. Back to let's see, I have some questions here that I wrote. Terminator 2, Terminator, especially T2, puts a lot of focus on Skynet. We're in a moment where AI is writing songs. The Beatles have a new hit. And if Hollywood could have it its way, write scripts. Have the machines taken over? And if so, is the T2 message antiquated?
So I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's not so much about the technology, it's about the social aspects and the politics. So I write about Terminator 2 more because it's about how you cope or struggle to cope when you know that the future is going to be very different in a very bad way. When you know that either there's going to be an AI robot takeover, or in our case, maybe that's one of those futures, but it's much more obvious that there's going to be environmental collapse, the way that affects our politics, the collapsing trust in institutions, the decline of middle-class opportunity, all those things we've talked about already. So you've got the Linda Hamilton, Sarah Connor character at the beginning of Terminator 2. Of course, she knows what's going to happen. People think she's crazy. She might even sometimes think she's crazy. She gets locked up for that. She previously was kind of forming a resistance movement down in Mexico. She's got her bunker
in Baja.
Yeah, I've never asked you what you're doing in Mexico, Jason, but don't tell me. But it's about what do you do with that knowledge? How do you respond to that future that is gonna happen? And I think more and more people are aware of collapse in various ways, and we're seeing it and we're feeling it across our politics, economics, environment, and so on. And it's kind of crazy making, because that's not reflected in most of mainstream media, or at all in mainstream media. Just how a number of kind of really difficult, possibly unavoidable situations are coming together. That's why we get Trump. That's why we get Brexit, that authoritarian populism, because the right is much better organized, actually, for that collapse politics than the left. So what do? We're in the Linda Hamilton situation, right? Do we start to think about, in addition to, the normal kind of left politics, actually forms of survival, forms of mutual support? You saw some of that in the pandemic. You've seen some of that in natural disasters. We need to accelerate those efforts. So that's how I really use Terminator 2 in the book. The one that is more explicitly in the book about artificial intelligence is a film that most people probably haven't heard of, called Colossus, which came out in 1970, which is a bit kind of like War Games, in that the US government has created this artificial intelligence strategic defense computer. And then they announced to the world, we're giving it all the control of the nuclear weapons, because it's going to make decisions in a very logical way, more than humans do. And of course that does not turn out well. But that is about trusting technology, and the thing we were talking about earlier, which is who writes the algorithms, what assumptions, and of course most of the time it's elites in one way or another. It's the Silicon Valley millionaires and billionaires, and they're asking us to trust those algorithms. And we already know through really great researchers and writers, just how racist and sexist those algorithms are. And yet that's supposed to be our future. So that's the concern about technology. It's not artificial intelligence in itself, I don't think.
Does a movie like 12 Monkeys tell us more about the future, or how not to change the past but learn from it?
Well, I think it says you can't change the past, unfortunately. It's so you have Bruce Willis at the beginning, right? He's seen his own death. He doesn't realize his own death. Spoiler alert. And again, that's a bit like the T2 situation. We have these premonitions. And actually, some of our premonitions are in science fiction films. We feel like we've seen this movie already. We just don't quite understand how we got there. And so the plot of the film, of course, is not about, he's already told at the beginning of the film, you cannot change this future. We just want to understand how exactly the virus was released and learn more about it. And so that's what he tries to do. But in a weird way, then he may have inadvertently caused the virus.
Yeah.
You go, it's one of those, your head starts to explode. But is that, again, how the crazy makingness of those premonitions, which turn out to be true, and how those are dismissed. So you have the psychologist, psychiatrist in the movie, who writes this book. Who writes this book on what she calls the Cassandra complex, how various people in history who have prophesied doom haven't been believed. And then of course it all comes true. So I think it's about that. And I think it's about how you cannot change fundamentals of the future because as the movie says, they've already happened. Carbon dioxide that we're emitting from our power systems, our transport systems, and so on, that stuff is going to stay in the atmosphere for 30 years. So we're now experiencing some of the damage that Exxon knew was going to happen in their private reports that they kept secret and buried, in exactly the period that some of these 70s and 80s sci-fi films were made. So again, there's a kind of circularity to it, and we cannot change that. And yet again, the tech bros come along and say, "Don't worry, technology is going to work that out. We're gonna scrub all the carbon dioxide from the air." They've been talking about that for 10 years, 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
It ain't going to happen. It's going to happen in a small way, but it's not the solution to the crisis, which is here already. I think you can say, I call it in the book early collapse politics, that we have to adjust to. And again, I'm self-conscious about it because you can sound like a doomer, right? You can start sounding like a crazy person. But look out the window.
I think it's an interesting time because I feel like people are kind of waking up to the idea of collapse, but I think a lot of people still see collapse through a science fiction lens. So collapse has to be some sort of massive frost all over the world, like day after tomorrow. And that's, nuclear destruction is how we thought collapse was going to look like when we were kids growing up in the Cold War. And that feels further and further away from the truth, even as we're seeing literal conflicts explode in Russia and the Middle East. They don't feel like world power nuclear situations, mainly because the U.S. isn't going to fight a war like WW2 anymore. It's going to be a proxy battle at this point. And
it's going to be about, one of the pressures is the huge number of refugees and climate refugees.
Yes, climate refugees.
That's how you get Brexit. That's how you get Brexit. You have a crop failure in Syria,
mm-hmm.
and then the right seizes on that to say we got to shut the borders. We got to get out of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
That's a sign to me. That's a sign of early collapse again.
But they're doing a great job on the wording because the fight becomes between liberals and conservatives, in my opinion, one of racism and a threat to security, to your not even middle class security, just your personal security.
Yeah.
And that becomes the argument. And it's not about the environment. And if you try to bring up the environment, you almost get looked at like some sort of hippie. It's like all of a sudden I'm wearing hemp pants, buddy. Like, no,
Yeah.
This is a real thing. People are leaving because of a lack of resources. I live in a country where my water gets shut off periodically, so people in the north can water their lawns. There's no lawns here. It's a desert. It's a desert by the ocean. So when you're blinded by environmental collapse because you don't live in an area like I grew up in Richmond, California, that's where everybody has cancer because you live next to a factory. You don't have polluted water like, the West Virginia because of blowing the tops off mountains for mountaintop mining and stuff like that. You don't really see the ecological damage the same way that maybe Bangladesh sees it, where the urban core is filled with dilapidated factories with exposed wiring, and the hinterlands of this very populated area has polluted water due to factories that are manufacturing like cheap leather and stuff like that. So, we are the beneficiaries of environmental collapse. So kind of like what you talk about with Blade Runner, maybe we're not living in the off-world colonies, but we're living high in the tower apartment with our robot sex toys. And that's
what I do at the weekend, Jason, is nothing. No, you're right, of course. But then you've got the pandemic, of course, which is kind of some of those things coming home, right? Because we're gonna be released, as the scientists told us, and as was predicted in science fiction and disaster movies, we're going to have more pandemics as we destroy the environment, come into contact with animals that we've never been in contact before, species we don't know anything about, whatever it turns out the actual source of the 2020 plus pandemic was, we are going to get more pandemics because of environmental exploitation. So some of that is going to come out. What have we been doing over the past 2 or 3 years? With the wildfires and pollution, we're sharing pictures on social media that look like fucking Blade Runner.
Yeah.
And we're going, is that real, or is that? Yeah, it's real. It's New York today. It's San Francisco today. So this stuff is coming home. But you're right. We get distracted, in part because of some sci-fi movies, by the apocalypse, the fast apocalypse scenario, whereas we're in a kind of slow dystopia scenario, the privileged amongst us. But we're all starting to feel it. And well, I just say one more thing. One of the other books, one of the other films I talk about in the book, V for Vendetta, goes back to your point about how the right exploits this. Because yes, it does rely on othering and saying we haven't got enough stuff, we need to exclude people from it. But also, in doing that, it says to a particular group of people, straight, white, middle-aged men in particular, we're going to look after you.
Yeah.
We're going to look, this is our promise to you. Now, unfortunately, that means, allowing some refugees to drown, but hey, this is now a security situation.
And they're a surplus population.
So, and they're surplus anyway, and they're economically unimportant anyway. So what does it matter? So where is the left's counter to that? Where is the left saying, no, we will look after you? And does the point where I end the book is, does some of that need to be in a somewhat older tradition of kind of community organizing, the Black Panthers, setting up social services that we actually need to go back to or incorporate into our politics. So when these multiple crises occur, we can say to people, we can help you. And this is an example of our politics of mutual cooperation and solidarity.
Well, here's a question for you. We have a situation right now in Israel and Palestine where, the people of Gaza live in an open air prison. We've heard it so many times that it kind of doesn't hit the same way anymore. And it's been like that forever. And these people are a surplus population for the most part. What's produced there that anyone's going to protect? Is any nation state going to come in and fight Israel? Is anyone going to fight on on the behalf of the Palestinian people? You may get some arms here and there from people, but is anyone really going to? Because ultimately, you're fighting a proxy war against the United States, and who's willing to step up and do that? I heard briefly some people in Congress talking about taking in refugees from the region. But what is the proper left response? How should we be thinking about this situation right now when it comes to organizing? Is protest the only way? I mean, I definitely think it's adding something to the conversation that if it wasn't there, people would probably just be swallowing the US/Israel line of these are all terrorists. Very good people on both sides kind of thing. How should we be looking at this? Should we be trying to talk to our Congress people right now about, well, let's take in refugees?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm by no means an expert on Israel, Palestine, but the broader point I would make is you've got to live your politics. And I think the general public is often quite smart. So let me pivot a bit to the climate crisis as an example, right? We've been telling people, and the environmental movement has been telling people, a climate crisis is on its way, a climate catastrophe is on its way, and it's getting closer. But how have we actually changed how we live? Have we been organizing for that? Where are the shelters going to be? How are we going to retrofit our cities so that people aren't dying from heat? By the way, we're going to get climate refugees in your own country, right? All those people in the Southwest.
Yep.
Where are they going to go?
Yep.
So it's not just an external thing. So I think there's something in the more people see us living our politics. If we say there are these multiple catastrophes or crises, okay, how are you responding to them? If you really believe this stuff is happening, again, the right, even though they are climate deniers, poverty deniers, racism deniers, democracy deniers, they're prepared for this. They have their politics fundamentally in place. And I don't think we do. Now, I'm kind of pleading with someone else, as it were, to do this work, because I don't have a background in kind of community organizing or anything like that. But I think people, yeah, they do want to see people taking in refugees. If they do want to see us thinking about how we can help people who have got heat stroke. They do want to see us thinking about what does emergency preparedness look like for flooding. And the more we can see, more we can show those things, people go, okay, that's your policy. I get it now. Mm-hmm. And I see you taking it seriously. Mm-hmm. And protest is obviously always going to be important, but protest in that sense is inherently passive, isn't it?
It feels very cathartic. Feels very cathartic.
It can do. What do you do after you go home?
Yeah.
I've been on marches. I went on marches for nuclear disarmament. Mm-hmm. There were hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who went on those marches in the 1980s, mm-hmm. when our fear was that Terminator nuclear Armageddon. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, but there were some people mm-hmm. who broke into Air Force bases mm-hmm. and symbolically disarmed missiles. And you know what happened in the UK, where I'm from? Mm-hmm. In most times when they went to trial, a jury said that's legitimate civil resistance.
Mm.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's Andreas Malm, if you've had on the podcast, right? Yeah. Brilliant. I mean, I think he's a beautiful writer as well. His book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting read.
No, I mean, look, I think, and I don't say this with any sort of joy, Israel-Palestine is showing you the future. Countries with means putting up big walls to keep out what they deem their surplus populations.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Yeah, maybe not ethno-states, but they're not the only place where there's walls. Right.
But you say maybe not ethno-states, but I mean, so we talk about V for Vendetta in the book, right? Yeah. It's a white Christian nationalist regime, mm-hmm. neo-fascist, obviously. Is that impossible to imagine in America after next year? No.
I think what I think.
Trump is talking about it.
I think the Proud Boys showed us that because of South American migration, what we would call down here in the Southern America's white people. In the States, they're called people of color, right? White Venezuelans, white Cubans. They were Proud Boys. They were in there too. Yeah. They're right-wing voters. A lot of these people live in Florida. They vote for people like Ron DeSantis. Yeah. So no, I think the American neo-fascist project is multiracial. I think it's got a DEI initiative, and I think it's working out just fine. I see more Black conservatives in the YouTube sphere than I've ever seen. Even when Black people were starting to get money in the 80s, even in the Fresh Prince 90s, the Tough on Crime 90s. This ain't even the Tough on Crime era, and there's just people willfully being conservatives of color. So that's what's going to make that project grow, is that it isn't going to look the same way that it looked in the 80s and 90s when it was a bunch of stay off my land, white people in camouflage, Ruby Ridge style stuff. Does that still exist? Hell yeah, it still exists. January 6th was filled with that. But I don't know if that's the end game for that project. But it just, the whole thing, I think, is something that we should be leery of, right? Walls. That being said, I want to end with this because I've been talking to you too long. And I know you have things that you have to do as it's early where you are. Would you call movies like Squid Games, The Platform, and Snowpiercer sci-fi? And part two to that question is, do you feel they possess a, quote, there is no alternative message? Or do you think they're hopeful allegories?
I don't know what The Platform is. I've not
It's a Spanish movie where it's like a prison and they're on these different platforms.
Yes, I've heard of it. Yeah. Yeah. I think I don't want to kind of sound like the only good sci-fi is the sci-fi I got around to watching, but there's a kind of bit of that in the sense that when I think about the movies that I talk about in the books, I think they kind of done it all.
Mm-hmm.
Everything we need to know fundamentally about what's happening and what's going to happen, you can kind of draw from those movies. So I say this in the afterward to the book. Yes, you could mention, you could talk about some more recent sci-fi films or TV programs, but essentially you go back to some of these movies or even before. They keep warning us, but the warnings have been made for 30, 40 years from that growth in more socially conscious sci-fi. So I can find some of them entertaining or interesting, how they put their own twist on it, but I don't feel like any of those movies are kind of telling me something I didn't know from either the sci-fi some of the sci-fi we've talked about, or just kind of looking out the window. I mean, I've loved. I like The Creator. I don't know whether you saw The Creator recently. I enjoyed it. I thought it was really interesting about artificial intelligence and the way that might affect the world. But I'm not sure there was anything kind of fundamentally new in it, and that's fine. That's fine. Very few things are going to say something new, right?
Yeah.
Very few books, very few movies, very few TV series. I mean, some of them are sci-fi. Again, I don't think you need the flying cars to be sci-fi. I think that's a distraction.
No, I agree. You know what? I've never seen Brazil, and today before the show, I started trying to watch Brazil. You know what? I've realized I never watched all the way through. It was 12 Monkeys. I watched 12 Monkeys earlier this morning, getting ready for this, because I'm reading about it in your book. I'm like, I vaguely remember Brad Pitt kind of rambling. And I came away. I was like, dude, 12 Monkeys is so good. and I'm just getting sucked into Brazil. I had to do an interview before I started talking to you. Look,
you finished 12 Monkeys.
I did finish 12 Monkeys.
The ending is the best ever because you can argue about what exactly it means. And
I wish we had more time because I want to ask you more about that ending. That movie kind of made me go, whoa, this is good, because it's very 90s in its presentation.
Yeah.
Terry Gilliam had a definite style of movie that he made, and that definitely fit with the camera angles and stuff like that. But when you get about halfway in, it's like, man, this movie is really, that second act, it's like, hold on to your seat. This is really getting exciting. So thank you for writing about these. You also made me watch Rollerball because you had an essay before the book came out about Rollerball that made me go actually read the Rollerball. I went and found that.
Yeah, you can find it online, I think.
Yeah, I found it online for free. So thank you for that. And I did avoid the I tried to watch the LL Cool J Rollerball. It does not hit the same way as that movie. We have a sports show here on This Is Revolution called Beyond the Red Zone, and I created an intro video for it where I use Rollerball and Tron. Two sports that don't really exist, right? Light cycles and
yet.
Play our cards right.
Yeah.
Wherever you are listening or watching this show, there's links in the description to the book Come With Me If You Want to Live by Dr. Micheal Harris. He's been on the show before promoting all of his books. I tell you guys to buy all these books. I've bought these books for people over the years because he's one of my favorite authors and he's someone that I feel very comfortable calling a friend.
Thank you very much, Jason.
So
appreciate it.
As soon as you're done with this show, we'll be in the Champagne Room. Toussaint and I, we will be live. This, sadly, is pre-recorded because of Dr. Harris's schedule and our 16-hour time difference. So thank you so much for making the time to do this.
Happy
Um,
to. Thank you for doing it.
and we are out.